Welcome back to the Timur Podcast, a show where you and I delve into the life, conquests, character, and legacy of Amir Timur. We have witnessed the early life, rise to power, and early conquests of Timur, or Tamerlane, and are currently in the year of 1383. But today we are going to do things a bit differently. This episode is not going to be about Timur. Or, to be more specific, the episode is not going to just be an episode about Timur. I'm actually going to give the spotlight to somebody else. But to see what I mean by this, we first need to do a quick historical recap. In the year 1206 AD, a man by the name of Temujin was proclaimed leader of a certain peoples at a tribal assembly. Temujin took on a new name, how we know him today as Genghis Khan, or Genghis Khan, and he had just united the tribes of the Mongolian steppe. And for the next 53 years, the vast armies of the Mongol hordes conquered half of the world, with an empire that ranged from Poland and Hungary in the west to Korea and Vietnam in the east, from Siberia in the north to the gates of Egypt and India in the south. During these 53 years or so, leadership of the empire would pass from Genghis to his son Ogadai, and then to Ogadai's son Guyuk, before finally going to the fourth and final great Khan of the Mongol Empire, Monk Khan, who was a grandson of the great Genghis Khan. But with the death of Monk Khan in the year 1259, the Mongol Empire split into four fragments, or as they're usually called, the four Khanates. The Mongol Empire would never again be fully united, aside from a very brief point in time where you could make the argument that Kublai Khan did unite the four Khanates, but this was mostly just in name, so it doesn't really count. The four Khanates would continue on as their own independent empires, each taking a different path in history, each taking on a unique culture and identity of their own, each fighting different wars, making different alliances, and even often engaged in conflict with each other. And although the Mongol Empire was gone, and there was no more great Khans, these four Khanates each became incredibly powerful and impressive in their own right, with their own leaders, their Khans, being some of the most influential and powerful men in the entire world in the 13th and 14th centuries. Thus, with each passing year, the hope for somebody to unite the four Khanates diminished. The empire's pieces were growing too far apart, too different. Still, though, for somebody to gain power of a single Khanate, well, now that was an incredible accomplishment. And each Khanate saw their fair shares of rulers, civil wars, claimants, rebellion, and so on. But time went on. Empires crumbled. And one by one, there we go, each of the four Khanates either collapsed, faded away, or were annexed by more powerful factions. So, the hope to unite the four Khanates into a reforged Mongol Empire was pretty far-fetched now. I mean, how are you going to unite the four Khanates when you don't even have the four Khanates to work with anymore? So instead, we start to see more and more guys trying to reform just a single Khanate. Let's take a look at this in action. The year is 1335. Abu Sa'id Bahadur Khan dies. And this man was the ninth and final ruler of the Ilkhanate. And the Ilkhanate, if you'll remember, was one of the four Khanates that we just discussed. It was in today what we would call Iran, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Armenia, and parts of Pakistan, Afghanistan, Turkey, and Iraq. But with the death of the ninth Ilkhan, the leadership of the Ilkhanate was unable to peacefully pass to the next intended ruler. Instead, the Ilkhanate was gone. It fractured into a dozen different pieces, with 100 different men all claiming that they were the rightful next ruler of the Ilkhanate. Now, let me introduce you to one of these men. Toga Temur was a young man who had grown up in prominence in the last few years of the Ilkhanate. And after the collapse of the Ilkhanate, Toga Temur very quickly announced that he was the next rightful Ilkhan. Now, big claim, to be sure, but actually the situation was not hopeless for Toga. To begin, he had already accomplished the best thing possible in claiming to be a rightful Khanate ruler. He had been born. More precisely, he had the right lineage. This man was a direct descendant of Hisar, who was Genghis Khan's brother way back when. So that's a check mark on having the right lineage. But secondly, Toga Temur also had a pretty firm base of support. He had become leader of the Shete tribe, and this tribe was a bit different than many other tribes that had settled in the former Ilkhanate. It had been made of originally primarily Mongolian men who had come with the initial conquests and then had taken Persian wives. And then, unlike many of their neighbors, the Shete people converted to Islam, but the minority Shia sect of Islam, not the larger majority sect of Sunni Islam. All this to say, they had created their own unique identity, they were proud of it, and they were fiercely loyal to their new leader, Toga Temur. So, things are looking good for him. He's got 2 of the 3 boxes checked on how to make a good claim to the Khanate throne checklist. Number 1, he's a descendant of Genghis Khan's family. Number 2, he's a leader of a tribe that is all about him. Now, if only he could fulfill the 3rd and final box, which is control an incredible region of land that is full of vibrant culture, natural resources, natural defenses, and hardy people. Oh wait, he's got that covered too. The Shete people had settled in the region known in much of history as Mazandaran. We've mentioned this region before, but let me go into a bit more detail here, because looking at pictures of this region while researching this episode, let me just tell you, it has very quickly moved up my list of places I need to visit. Okay, so Mazandaran. Mazandaran is located in modern-day Iran, right on the southern coasts of the Caspian Sea. It is, quote-unquote, a narrow strip of land that runs along the Caspian Sea on one side, and then you have the Alborz mountain range on the other side. All in all, it's about 24,000 square kilometers of land, and it is home to many important natural resources such as natural gas, oil, fish, and agriculture of all kinds. And today there are about 3.4 million people who live here. But people have been living and thriving here for thousands of years, possibly even tens of thousands of years. Because here's the thing. This is a place of life. The immense snowfall of the Alborz Mountains, coupled with the various waterways that run off of the Caspian Sea, mean that this land is dissected with countless rivers and streams and is incredibly well irrigated both naturally and then man-made as well. As such, crops of all sorts have always been grown here in abundance. But perhaps most notably, and one of the most famous things about this region, is the trees. Mazandaran has a couple of trees. How many trees do you say? Well, like 2.5 million acres of trees. We're talking oceans of forests. Forests that boast all sorts of wildlife, an incredible lumber industry, and natural beauty that will just make your jaw drop. Seriously, if you need something to cheer you up, Google Mazandaran countryside in the spring, and you will not be disappointed. This place is gorgeous. But anyway, as you can imagine, because this region is so rich in natural resources, food, and the natural defenses of mountains on one side and the Caspian Sea on the other, humans have lived here for a long time. And with humans comes settlement, and with settlement comes cities. And during the 14th century, the greatest of cities in Mazandaran was the city of S3Ep4. So let me talk about this city just very briefly. S3Ep4, which is known as the city of Gorgan today, starts to appear on maps in the 400 and 500s AD, probably gaining influence during the Sassanid Persian days, but it's likely people lived here far earlier. The city became a huge hub of commerce thanks to its location on both the Silk Road and near to the Caspian Sea. It was and is famous for its fish, silk, fruit, woodworking, and was also a center for coin minting, which is actually where a lot of our knowledge on local chronology of events comes from. Another interesting thing about Astarabad, or the city of Gorgon, is the Great Wall of Gorgon, which is a man-made defensive wall that stretches from Mazandaran in the west straight east, roughly dividing the settled peoples of the south from the dangers of the steppe. The wall was also made probably in the 400 and 500s AD by the Sassanid Persians to help protect their empire against various nomadic marauders, such as the White Huns. And this wall stretched for 200 kilometers, making it the third longest man-made wall ever after the Great Wall of Korea and the Great Wall of China, which both of those also being made to protect settled peoples from nomadic raids. Anyway, going back to this city of Astarabad. The city thrived for centuries, but this was abruptly brought to an end in the year 1210, when armies from the Kingdom of Georgia sacked the city, and then its deconstruction was finalized only about 12 years later, when the Mongols came sweeping through and systematically flattened the city, as we have seen many times on this podcast. But also, like we've seen many times on this podcast, humanity's will is slow to break, and Astarabad was rebuilt. Its legacy was not forgotten, and it very quickly rebounded and again became the most important city in the region. And getting back to the 1340s with this Ilkhanate claimant, Toga Temur, Astarabad became his capital. So, getting back to Toga Temur's claim to reuniting the throne of the Ilkhanate, he's got the lineage, he's got the tribal support, he's got the incredibly rich land of Mazandaran, and he's got a great capital city of Astarabad. What does this mean? It's time to go to war. And go to war he does, for like 15 years, constantly fighting his neighbors on all sides, back and forth, back and forth. Now, to be fair, he does expand his territories a bit. He takes some land in what today is eastern Azerbaijan and northern Iran, but he is unable to really make any lasting headway into reforging the former Ilkhanate. And one of the reasons why this is so hard for him is that his southeastern neighbors are just annoying and constantly at war with him. These neighbors are, well, we've actually met them before on the show, but these are the Sarbadars, one of the big Persian five, as we've been calling them. And Toga Temur regularly battles with the various leaders of the Sarbadars until finally, in 1353, they agree to make peace with him, maybe even accept his leadership. All of this is going to be set in place at an elaborate banquet. And at this banquet, in which Toga Temur is in Sarbadar lands with all of his friends and family and closest supporters, the Sarbadars just kill him, and all of them. And that is the end of Toga Temur's attempt to reunite the Ilkhanate. So why do I tell you this? Well, Toga Temur had a son, a boy named Lukman, and thankfully Lukman had not been at this banquet. He was back home in Astarabad, and now he becomes the ruler of the kingdom that his father had established. But the Sarbadars aren't done. They want Mazandaran. So they quickly build an army that captures Astarabad and most of Mazandaran, forcing Lukman to flee for his life. But Lukman still had supporters, and one of these supporters was the former governor of the city of Astarabad, who had governed the city for Lukman's father. And this governor also had a son. This son's name was Wali, or sometimes called Vali. So these two sons, forced from their homes by the Sarbadars, flee into the hills and mountains of Mazandaran to escape. They live here for several years, living among the local herdsmen, trying to communicate with other potential allies and supporters, and biding their time to return home. And 3 years later, in 1356, the time comes. The Sarbadars are going through a civil war, and most of their soldiers leave Mazandaran to go back to central Persia to deal with those problems at home. And that's when Wali and Lukman return to Astarabad. They are welcomed back into the city. Lukman is announced ruler of Mazandaran just like his father, and Wali is acting as his governor and captain until he can do it completely for himself. Seriously, Lukman just needs a little help to get going, and then Wali will certainly step down. Okay guys, I'm serious. Wali is a good guy. He's only ruling for Lukman because he has to. Lukman is the rightful ruler, we all know that, but Wali is the brains of the operations. He's just making sure everything runs smoothly. Don't worry about it. Okay, we all know where this is going. Wali starts by helping Lukman rule the city and province, but very quickly realizes that A, he is a better ruler, and B, he kind of likes ruling. So Wali announces that he is the new ruler of the city of Astarabad and Mazandaran, and gives himself the title of Amir Wali. Lukman is not executed, thankfully, but is instead exiled out of the country. So, this is Amir Wali, and he is one of the big Persian 5 that we've listed in the last 3 episodes or so. This is how Amir Wali came to power. But the year is only 1356 right now. Amir Timur hasn't even become Amir at this point. We're 25 years before Timur shows up in Persia. So, what is Amir Wali doing during this whole time? Well, it's that time again. It is time to go to war. The Sarbadars don't like that Amir Wali has just taken Astarabad from them, so they send an army to deal with him, and Amir Wali defeats them. So they send a second army, defeated. Third army, defeated. But finally, a fourth Sarbadar army is able to take Astarabad and force Amir Wali to flee for his life again. And I couldn't help but notice the similarities between Wali and Timur, Timur was doing a very similar thing at about this same point in time. Wali is in the ashes of the former Ilkhanate, taking Astarabad from the Sarbadars before losing it to them. And similarly, Timur is in the ashes of the former Chagatai Khanate, taking Samarkand from the Mughals before losing it to them. And like Timur, Wali was forced to flee into the countryside. From 1366 until about 1374, Wali was again living amongst various nomads, seeking support and biding his time to return. And this time came when the Sarbadars again had to return home. They had just been attacked by the Kartid dynasty and were needed to defend their homes. So they leave, and that's when Wali returns to Mazandaran and reestablishes himself there as Amir. And now things really start to go well for him. The Sarbadar state is in turmoil. They're at war with the Kartids and also engaged in a civil war. So Amir Wali uses this opportunity to consolidate his rule, expand his territory, taking several cities, such as the cities of Bistam, Damgan, and Ray, and then he gets involved in Sarbadar politics. The Sarbadars are now split into 2 sides. One side, led by various religious dervishes, is supported by the Kartid dynasty of Herat. The other side, led by a man named Ali Muayyad, gains the support of Amir Wali, with the Sarbadar civil war becoming a sort of proxy war between Wali and the Kartids of Herat, each supporting a different side. And things go very well for Amir Wali. He proves himself to be an excellent ruler and commander, and he takes the Sarbadar capital of Sabzavar in the year 1380. He puts his ally and friend Ali Muayyad on the Sarbadar throne, which ends the Sarbadar civil war, and then he returns home. The campaign had gone beautifully, and now he has an ally to his south, he has expanded his realm, and he has a very solid base of power. But then, disaster strikes. Like the Sassanid Persians of old, Mazandaran is threatened by nomadic hordes from the north. The year is 1381, and Amir Timur is here. We covered what happened here a few episodes ago with Timur's first invasion of Persia. In this invasion, Timur destroyed the Kartid dynasty of Herat, subdued the Sabdars of central Persia, and then invaded the territory of Mazandaran, controlled by Amir Wali. One of Wali's cities, the city of S3Ep4, was sacked and destroyed, and the show of strength forced Amir Wali to submit to Timur. Apologies were sent, tribute was sent, and a promise of submission was made. But Amir Wali did not come in person. And then the nomadic hordes of Timur left as quickly as they had come. Amir Wali probably thought that this had been just a temporary setback. After all, the politics of the steppe are fickle. Surely Timur had already been backstabbed and killed by his countless rivals and would never return. So Amir Wali got back to the business of running his kingdom for himself. He had no intention to bow to some nomad from the steppe. But Amir Wali's ally, the Sardar leader, Ali Muayyad, had a different view. Ali Muayyad had also submitted to Timur, but he showed no intentions to go back on that submission now that Timur was gone. Well, this causes a falling out between Wali and Muayyad, so Wali gathers his army and marches to the capital of the Sardars, the city of Sabzavar. Ali Muayyad and the Sardars needed to be taught a lesson. This was Persia, and it would be ruled by Persians, men who would not bow to nomadic raiders from the north. But Timur is no mere nomadic raider. And hearing that two of his new Persian subjects are fighting, he returns in the year 1382. And we covered this 2 episodes ago with Timur's second invasion of Persia. Timur lifts the siege, and Amir Wali is forced to flee back to Mazandaran. Timur follows Wali, destroys Wali's ally, the man Ali Beg, and this forces Amir Wali to submit to Timur for a second time. He sends tribute and gifts and promises, but again, not showing up in person. However, Timur is content with this for the time being, and he returns home to Samarkand before embarking on a campaign against the Mirabanids of Sistan, which we covered last episode. So, the year is now the end of 1383, and Amir Wali is in a dangerous situation. He has submitted to Timur twice, but he has never submitted in person. You know that's a problem. I know that's a problem. And Amir Wali knows that's a problem. He gambled the first time, hoping that Timur wouldn't return, but Timur returned. And now it's only a matter of time until Timur returns again, forcing the complete submission of Amir Wali. So what do? Do you prepare the defenses? That seems pretty desperate and maybe even hopeless. Well, what about submitting to Timur in person? Well, I don't know about you, but I would be terrified to do that. Amir Timur was not known for being merciful to people who had repeatedly caused him problems. So, Amir Wali thinks. Chances are, with how quickly Timur has expanded into Iran and Afghanistan, chances are that Wali isn't the only one who is worried about this. Amir Wali needs friends. If he hopes to stay ruler of Mazandaran, he cannot do it alone. So let's do a quick survey of Wali's neighbors and potential allies. To the west, in the Caucasus, there are 2 primary powers. Now, we haven't really met these guys yet, but very briefly for now, these powers are the Christian Kingdom of Georgia and then the Muslim Black Sheep Turkomans. Now, don't worry, we will talk about them much more in the future, but for now, Wali ruled them out. The Georgians were Christian and traditional enemies of Mazandaran, and the Black Sheep Turks were way too busy fighting some of their own enemies to be bothered with this. Okay, well, let's look the other way. What about the other members of the big Persian 5 that we've been talking about? 2 of those were Wali's eastern neighbors, the Sardars and the Kartids. Well, the Sardars were loyal subjects of Timur and also traditional enemies of Wali, so they're out. And the Kartid dynasty of Herat doesn't exist anymore, so they're out too. And that leaves only 2 other powers that Wali could call upon. the Muzaffarid dynasty of southern Persia, and the Jalayir dynasty of Iraq and western Persia. And so Amir Wali does just this. The only way that Timur can be stopped is if some sort of coalition of allies comes together and use their combined strength against him. Amir Wali sends a message to the two leaders of these two powers. These leaders are Shah Shoja, leader of the Muzaffarids, and Sultan Ahmad Jalayir, ruler of the Jalayir dynasty of Iraq. And one of our primary sources, written by Ahmad ibn Arab Shah, tells us what this letter may have said. Arab Shah says that Amir Wali's cry for help read as such: "I am your defense. If my affairs are well contrived, yours will be also. But if disaster befalls me from him, it will also reach your kingdoms. If you both aid me, I shall serve you by stopping him. If not, Timur will happen to you." That is a pretty terrifying message, but the truth and the strategy of it was spot on. Unfortunately, though, Amir Wali did not receive the responses he wanted. Shah Shoja of the Muzaffarids responded that he was taking the approach of making peace with Timur. And we actually saw this 2 episodes ago with Shah Shoja and Timur exchanging communication, saying hi, and recognizing the rule of one another. Sultan Ahmad Jalayir, ruler of the Jalayirids, the realm that stretched from the Persian Gulf up through Iraq with the mighty city of Baghdad, then into eastern Iran and into Azerbaijan with the beautiful city of Tabriz, Sultan Jalayir also responded, and Arab Shah gives us his response. "Does this maimed and lame Jagatai trample upon both of our kingdoms? If he has firmly resolved to invade our countries, he will rush to his own fate, and his ambitions will abandon him. For certainly we are a race possessing courage and vigor and equipment and numbers and power and high spirit, and it is our habit to hold our heads high and show pride." I mean, it's a better response than "I've made peace with Timur," but it still isn't what Amir Wali wanted. It's not what he needed. There are no reinforcements coming. He was left alone to fight against Timur. So he sent back one last response to the Jalayirids and the Muzaffarids, and you can hear the desperation, the anger, and the predictions of this response. Arab Shah says Wali responded with this: "Truly by Allah, with vigorous purpose and confident spirit, I will meet Timur. If he conquers me, the fault will not be mine. Upon you will fall the overpowering fate of complete disaster." The die was cast. There was no going back. War with Timur was only now a matter of time. But war was something that Amir Wali was no stranger to. No, he intended to throw everything he had at Timur. Amir Timur would pay for every inch with blood. So the city of Astarbad was stocked up with weapons and food. Its walls were reinforced and its garrison prepared. Then men went out into the vast forests of Mazandaran, and they felled countless trees. These trunks were thrown into the roads, into the mountain passes. Bridges were destroyed, canals were broken, and paths were swamped. Pits were also dug across all of the roads, and in these pits were fixed sharpened stakes pointing upwards. And then these pits were filled with water so that these holes of death appeared to only be puddles. Mazandaran was turned into a fortress waiting for Timur. After Timur's conquest of Sistan, which we covered last episode, he returned to Samarkand and stayed there for 3 months, celebrating his victory, rewarding his soldiers and followers, and taking care of the political side to running his empire. But war was always on his mind. And in the end months of 1383 or early months of 1384, Timur gave word for the army to be gathered. It was time to deal with Amir Wali once and for all. Timur marched to the city of Balkh, where he waited for the contingents of his forces to gather. The nomadic Chagatai tribes of Mawarnar came, riding upon their thousands of horses with sabers and bows in hand. The mountain Afghan men of Badakhshan, Herat, and Sistan came, men who were renowned for their bravery, ambush skills, and battle stamina. Persians and Sarbadars came, men skilled in spear and bow, able to fight both mounted and on foot in equal excellence. The armies of Timur were here. Supposedly 100,000 strong, probably an exaggeration, but certainly tens of thousands. Once the army was assembled at Balkh, they set out, through northern Persia and into the eastern borders of Mazandaran. Timur stayed with the main, slower army, but he sent several vanguard units ahead to scout, clear paths, and skirmish against any enemies. And Amir Wali was right there to meet them. Timur would not be given this land, he would have to take it. Historian René Grousset describes Amir Wali's brave but desperate situation with this. This man bravely defended every step of his ground, from the Atrek River to the heart of the forest. And even Yazdi, our most pro-Timur source, admits that Amir Wali and Wali's soldiers, quote, fought with heroic valor and resolution. The first battle took place between Amir Wali's skirmishers and Timur's vanguard, led by a man named Mobakher. The two sides found each other and immediately engaged with a charge. Mobakher led the Timurid men himself, but before he could reach Amir Wali's forces, an arrow was shot at him. This arrow crashed through Mobakher's teeth, ran through his mouth, and burst out the back of his neck. The Timurids faltered as their captain fell, and Wali's men surged forward, led by the archer that had fired the shot. And then, imagine the terror on both sides as Mobakher's head raises up. His elbows lift up, then his arms, and he pushes himself to his feet. His face is mangled, blood is streaming from his mouth, and he's almost unrecognizable, but his eyes are filled with rage. And with an enraged, blood-filled yell, he gets up, pulls out his saber, and charges at the archer who had shot him. The archer, this man, is stunned at what he's witnessing, and he can't react fast enough to Mobakher cutting him to the ground. Then his neck is hacked, his severed head raised, and Mobakher throws the head at Wali's forces. Well, that settles that. Wali's men start a hasty but somewhat organized retreat, and Timur's vanguard chases in hot pursuit. Despite his injuries, Mobakher would live, amazingly, and for his bravery, Timur would give him several villages and lands in eastern Mazandaran. The Timurid vanguard then soon reached the fortress of Darun, one of Amir Wali's easternmost forts that he had fortified in preparation. But it was no match. The Timurid vanguard stormed the fort and slaughtered the defenders. Timur reached his vanguard with the rest of his army, but now the slog begins. The Timurids are in enemy territory and everything has been prepared for them. The roads are blocked, the rivers flooded, there are traps laid everywhere, and they are constantly harassed by horse archers and skirmishers sent by Wali. But Timur is no stranger to war either. The first problem that needs to be fixed is the clearing of roads, the building of bridges, and engineer work. And in true Timur fashion, he does this extremely efficiently with his corps of military engineers who their entire job is to build roads, take care of logistics, and make sure that the army can move from point A to point B in the most efficient way possible. And also in true Timur fashion, Timur sends a message to his own engineers saying that if any of them leave or abandon the campaign or switch sides, Timur will find them and he will kill them. The march to Astarabad begins, with Timur's engineers clearing the roads and his soldiers fighting off the constant attacks and harassment from the enemy. And for 20 days, this is what happens. The Timurids barely make any headway. They have to take the time to clear the paths while all the while fighting off Wali's men. And then the night falls. So Amir Timur orders that defenses be made, pits dug, walls set up, guards posted. And then the next day, it's the same exact thing. Creep forward, fight, build camp, sleep. Creep forward, fight, build camp, sleep. But with each day, the Timurids get closer and closer to Astarabad, Amir Wali's capital. And Amir Wali decides that this current strategy just isn't doing enough. An attack has to be made, so he has to throw everything he has left at Timur. And to give credit where credit is due, Amir Wali is a good commander. Wali knew exactly what part of Timur's camp he wanted to hit. The northernmost part of the advancing army and the camp was deemed the weakest, and it was commanded by Timur's son, the Prince Miran Shah. And Miran Shah was known for being reckless in battle, so Wali decided that that would be the target. If he could attack this side and goad Miran Shah into fighting, perhaps the prince could be killed. And if Timur lost a portion of his army and one of his sons, which would be his second son that was killed, there was a good chance he wouldn't be able to continue. Risky strategy? Absolutely. But Amir Wali has no other choices. He has no friends. The Jaliyurids and Muzaffarids have refused to help. It is Amir Wali alone. So, the 20th day of the campaign comes. Amir Wali leaves Astarabad with his army and marches to Timur's camp. They reach the portion where Miran Shah commands, and the orders for attack are given. The Timurids think that this is simply more skirmishing like it's been every day for 3 weeks now, but no, this is a full-on assault, and the Timurids are caught off guard. Wali's men storm into the northern part of Timur's camp, overpowering the Timurid guards and the first line of camps. Things are going great for Amir Wali at first. But Timur is no fool when it comes to setting up camp each night, and every night he orders that his new camp be fortified with pits, trenches, and walls just in case. And now, this preparation was all worth it. Wali and his men have pushed through the outermost portion of the camp, but now they were at the defenses. They began clambering down through the trenches and began scaling the roughly made walls, and this is when Prince Miran Shah arrives with reinforcements. And as Wali's first wave of attackers is struggling, climbing through these trenches, Timurid arrows fill the sky. Wali's men fall by the hundreds, filling the trenches with bodies, and now, hearing of the attack, Timur has also arrived on Wali's southern flank, charging into the men of Mazandaran. Wali's army disintegrates into a rout, with men trampling one another in a feverish attempt to escape, while the Timurids are on their heels, shooting and cutting down anybody who falls behind. And worse, Wali's own traps, the water pits filled with spikes, are now dotting the road his men are running on. And in the chaos, his men fall into the very traps they had left for the Timurids, being impaled and drowning. Amir Wali reaches Astarabad with his reserves mostly intact, but there's no time to waste. He knows what he has to do. The war is lost. So Amir Wali goes running into his home, his palace, gathers his family, his closest friends, his guards, and the small group flees Astarabad, leaving the people and the surviving soldiers to their own fate. Timur's men reached the city soon thereafter, and the fate of the city was sealed. Any defense that was there was quickly overcome, and the Timurids entered the city. Yazdi says this about the resulting outcome. Our soldiers burnt and destroyed everything, without sparing either old man, woman, or children, even suckling infants. The people were killed, Astarabad was sacked, the city was destroyed. Amir Wali's kingdom of Mazandaran was no more. As for Amir Wali, he and his small group of refugees fled to the city of Ray. Although this wasn't exactly a city. Don't get me wrong, Ray had once been an incredible city, one of the most impressive cities of Persia, but it was another place that had been wiped off the face of the earth by the Mongol conquests 160 years prior. And Ray had not been rebuilt yet. It was still an abandoned field of destroyed buildings with only a handful of inhabitants scratching out a living. Amir Wali was forced to abandon his friends and family here because Timur's scouts were hot in pursuit, and Wali only escaped by running into the forests and hiding from the Timurids. As for Timur, He and his army then reached the ruins of Ray, where he split the army into several smaller forces. These forces were sent out in all directions to subdue or sack the rest of Mazandaran and northwest Persia. Although much of the countryside was ravaged, much of it was spared, as many smaller local rulers quickly hurried to Timur's men and swore their submission and service. Those who did not submit fled for their lives or were killed and replaced. About 300 kilometers to the west of the ruins of Ray lay another Persian city. This was the city of Sultaniya. Today, Sultaniya is a small, somewhat isolated village of about 8,000 people. But 600 years ago, Sultaniya was one of the most important cities in the entire Middle East, and now it lay only a few days' ride from where Timur currently was. But why was this city so important? What was the history of it? Well, I'm glad you asked, because we need to understand what Sultaniya was. So travel back with me a few decades from where we are now, and let's get some quick backstory. The year is 1300 or so, and the Ilkhanate, one of the 4 Mongolian Khanates, is still alive and kicking. This is the Khanate that covered most of Iran, Azerbaijan, the Caucasus, parts of eastern Turkey, Iraq, and Pakistan. The Khanate we've been talking the most about this episode. The capital city of the Ilkhanate, for most of its existence, was the vital city of Tabriz, which we just mentioned, sits in the northwestern corner of Iran today. Tabriz is, and has long been, one of the greatest cities of the Middle East, but we'll talk more about that next episode probably. But anyway, Tabriz was the capital. Meanwhile, though, the Ilkhans, that is, the various leaders of the Ilkhanate, often liked to head southeast during the summer months. Thus, they established a summer getaway city, which also served as a seasonal capital. This city was named Sultaniya, which roughly translates to the regal. Now, fast forward a few years, and we reach the reign of the 8th Ilkhan, that is, Ilkhan Oljetu, who ruled from 1304 until 1316. And of the many things that Oljetu did, one of them was move the permanent residence of the Ilkhanate capital to Sultaniya. So Sultaniya becomes the permanent city of the Ilkhanate from about 1306 until the Ilkhanate's collapse in 1335. It has not been the main or the longest capital of the Ilkhanate, those titles would go to the city of Tabriz, but Sultaniya had been the last capital of the Ilkhanate. And in addition to being the last capital of the Ilkhanate, it was also an impressive city in its own right. Under Oljetu's direction, it went from a small town to a bustling city in a matter of a few years. By the year 1400 or so, this was one of the largest trade hubs in Persia. A man named Roy Gonzalez de Clavijo, a Spaniard, traveled through the city in about 1403 or so, and marveled at how its streets and markets would become packed with merchants and traders from all around the world, some coming from as far as Italy, or India, or China. And as a side note, Clavijo wrote one of our best sources on Amir Timur, but we'll talk more about him at another time. Back to the city of Sultaniya, though, what the city became famous for, in addition to what we just said, is what's called the Dome of Sultaniya. This was, and is, a massive mausoleum crowned with a mighty brick dome. Construction of the building had started prior to Oljetu ruling, but it mostly finished with his oversight by 1316, and he's actually buried there to this day. Because thankfully, this dome still stands. It is the 3rd largest brick dome in existence after the Hagia Sophia of Constantinople and the Florence Cathedral of Florence. And if you visit today or see pictures, you will see this massive and impressive structure rising out of nowhere on the plains, surrounded by smaller buildings or ruins. A monument to a time long lost. A later Egyptian Mamluk historian named Al-Yusufi tells that the construction of this dome and the city of Sultaniya was a massive project. After all, most of the city basically had to be built from the ground up, as it wasn't a large settlement before. Al-Yusufi claims that a construction team of 12,000 men, 5,000 camels, and 10,000 donkeys was needed simply to transport all of the supplies, the lumber, and the stones and brick to Sultaniya in order to build it up. But build it up the Ilkhanate did, and only Tabriz could rival it in the near vicinity. So what does this mean for Timur? Well, obviously, any large and economic city is a tempting target, but Sultaniya was way more than that. This city had been the last capital city of the Ilkhanate. We've already seen how Timur was putting himself in the shoes of the restorer of the Ilkhanate and the Mongol legacy. He had been gathering Ilkhanate claimants to his court. He claimed his birth year as the same year the Ilkhanate had collapsed, and he subdued or eradicated the Sarbadars, the Kartids of Herat, the Mirabanids of Sistan, and now Amir Wali of Mazandaran, all of whom had previously been subjects of the Ilkhanate. If Timur could actually control, hold court in the previous capital of the Ilkhanate, well, then that would show the world, especially other former Ilkhanate lands, that he was here to say, he was here to stay. There we go. It was such a big build-up and then I slipped. That he was here to stay and that his name should be known. There was a problem with this, though. Sultaniya had not been controlled by Amir Wali. No, it was actually controlled by the Jalayirids, one of the big Persian five we've mentioned, who were primarily stationed in Baghdad and Iraq, but had recently expanded their influence into western Iran and Azerbaijan. And currently, the Sultan of the Jalayirid dynasty, Sultan Ahmad Jalayir, was with his army in the city of Sultaniya. And the whole time that Timur had been fighting Amir Wali and Mazandaran, Sultan Jalayir had been strengthening Sultaniya, reinforcing the walls and preparing for the defense, because he too was interested in claiming the legacy of the Ilkhanate and was not at all eager to let Timur take this important city. So the board is set, the pieces moving. A huge showdown is about to take place. Amir Timur, who controls half of the former Chagatai Khanate and half of the former Ilkhanate, now marching westwards. And Ahmad Jalayir, leader of the powerful Jalayirid dynasty, controlling many immensely important lands and cities such as Bursa, Baghdad, Tabriz, and here Sultaniya. The ultimate battle between these two world powers is upon us. And it's about as anticlimactic as you can imagine. Survivors of Amir Wali's destroyed army reach Sultan Ahmad and tell him how powerful Timur's army is and how resistance is just futile. Oh, and by the way, this huge army of Timur, it's only a few days away. Well, Sultan Ahmad is terrified. He talked a big game in those letters he had sent to Amir Wali months prior, but now that the storm was here, now that Timur was here, Sultan Ahmad's bite could not match up his bark. He gathered his army and advisors together and fled the city, leaving only a token force behind to fight the Timurids and cover his retreat. Meanwhile, some of Timur's scouts are on the horizon. 60 Timurid horsemen approach Sultaniya. Yes, you heard that right, 60. And they expect to see the might of the Jalayirid armies ready before them. But instead, it is a city that has been abandoned by its protectors. The population is terrified, and the few Jalayirid soldiers left behind have no desire to defend the doomed city, which everyone knows that's just suicide. Thus, the 60 Timurid men are welcomed in. They just enter through the main gate, and the population welcomes them as the new rulers of Sultaniya. Timur arrives a few days later and the city is taken, but spared since they gave up without a fight. Thus, Timur's conquest of Sultaniya, if it can even be called a conquest, was probably one of the easiest acquisitions of city he would ever experience. And now, here in the throne room of the former Ilkhanate, Timur held court. Locals from the surrounding regions and smaller towns came to him with gifts of tribute, bowing the knee and kissing the royal carpet. Timur's men were rewarded with treasures and slaves taken in the campaigns. The city of Sultaniya was set up as a hub of operations, as Timur organized more raiding parties to go out from here and continue to harass the countryside and spread the name of Amir Timur. A garrison was set in the city and a governor was established. There was one man chosen to help establish Sultaniya, to help rebuild the countryside, and then he was named governor of Astarabad, and his name was Luqman. If you'll remember, Lukman was the son of Toga Temur, who had been at first helped but then betrayed by Amir Wali years prior. Well, Lukman had not sat idly by when he was betrayed and banished by Wali. He had gone to Timur's court, asking for help, and now, albeit under Timur's banner, Lukman gained control of much of his father's previous territory. This means that Timur had just made a huge step in his campaigns. Yes, he had dealt with the thorn in his side that was Amir Wali's kingdom in Mazandaran, and yes, he had conquered much of northern Iran. That's all well and good, but he also had just placed Lukman, a descendant of Ilkhanate royalty, of Mongolian royalty, back in power in his name, and he had just held court in the former capital of the Ilkhanate, the city of Sultaniya. Timur was basically telling the world that he was on track to restore the Ilkhanate, or at least claim himself as the heir to Ilkhanate territory. Now, let's take a minute and zoom out a bit to the larger picture. Timur himself cannot restore the Mongol Empire. He is not a descendant of Genghis Khan. The Yasa, or traditional Mongol codes, will not allow Timur to inherit the Mongolian throne. So what does he do? He marries into the family. He takes the title of Timur Guragin, which means Timur son-in-law. He is saying that he is the son-in-law to none other than Genghis Khan. And not only that, but Timur also gathers around him a host of Genghis Khan's descendants to use as his own pawns when necessary. But the Mongol Empire is gone. And not only that, but the four khanates that the Mongol Empire split into, they're also all gone. So if Timur wants to, in any shape or form, claim that he's the heir to the Mongol Empire, he has to focus on restoring the four khanates. So how is this going for him? Well, the easternmost khanate, the former Yuan dynasty, is pretty much gone, and Timur has not had much interaction with these former Mongol lands yet. So let's move on to number 2. Khanate number 2, the Chagatai Khanate, the land that Timur is actually from. Well, things are going pretty well here. The Chagatai Khanate had split into 2 portions, and Timur very firmly controlled the western half, Mawarnar. That was his home, and it was securely in his control for now. Not only that, and I've mentioned this a bit here and there, but we haven't really talked about it too much, but Timur was not actually the ruler of the Timurid Empire at this part in time. The ruler, or rulers during Timur's life, was a series of various puppet khans who were all descendants of Genghis Khan. Now, we haven't spent much time on them because they were essentially figureheads that had zero power. Wretches like insects stuck in the mud is how one of our sources described these guys. Everybody knew it was Timur who was the real guy in charge, but nonetheless, this was a good start on restoring the Chagatai Khanate. He had half of it in his control, he had the puppet khans, only the eastern half, Mogulistan, stood in his way of restoring the Chagatai Khanate. But Khan Kamruddin of the Mughals had been beaten time and time again, so Timur was not too worried about Mogulistan at this moment. They would be dealt with in time. Okay, so Timur's grasp on the former Chagatai Khanate lands were looking pretty good. How about the third Khanate, the Golden Horde of the Russian steppe? Well, going back a few episodes, the Golden Horde still did exist, but was split between the western and eastern halves, along with a third portion in the Crimean Peninsula that had broken off, being led by the powerful warlord Mamai. But Timur had an ace up his sleeve here. He had saved, helped, and restored a man named Toktamish as ruler of the eastern half of the Golden Horde. This man was Timur's ally, Timur's adopted son, and while Timur had been busy in Persia the last few years, Toktamish had been busy in the Golden Horde. We'll talk more about this next episode, but for now, Timur's prospects of reunifying and controlling the Golden Horde, although through his ally and adopted son Toktamish, that was all looking pretty good for now. And as for the last Khanate, the Ilkhanate of the Middle East, Well, we've been talking about them quite a lot, and things are looking good. Timur controls half or so of the former Ilkhanate lands. He's got a puppet Ilkhan ruling in his name, and he now controls Sultaniya, the former capital of the Ilkhanate. So, we are now at the end of 1384 and the beginning of 1385. Timur's third invasion of Persia has ended. After placing garrisons in his newly acquired territories and setting up government structures, Timur and the majority of his army returned home to Samarkand and the land of Mawarnar. And this is where we will leave the Amir for this episode, celebrating at his home with his people and family and rewarding the men for their loyalty and military performance. But whether or not Timur knew, although he probably suspected, there were a few problems, a few points of contention with the state of Timur's empire. First of all, Amir Wali had been defeated and all of his lands taken, but the man had escaped. At this very minute, Amir Wali was entering the city of Tabriz as a refugee, which was a city controlled by the Jalayirids. Speaking of, the second problem is that Timur was now basically at war with the Jalayirid dynasty. The two powers had not fought, but Timur had just taken Sultaniya from them. War was sure to follow. And Sultan Ahmad Jalayir was also currently at the city of Tabriz, welcoming Amir Wali and preparing for Timur's inevitable return. And thirdly, although it's not really a problem yet, but whatever did become of Toktamish, Timur's prodigy in the lands of the Golden Horde? It has been several years since Timur had helped him rise to power. What has Toktamish been up to? Maybe it was time for Timur to check up on him before anything negative happened. Next episode, we will go back to one of the main characters of Timur's story, Toktamish, up in the steppe of Russia. We'll go back a few years to see how he has been faring, what he's been doing, before catching up to where we are now in the year 1385. But for now, it is time to bring this episode to a close. Thank you so much for listening to the Timur Podcast. I do have one quick thing to say in regards to planning purposes. My goal is to release an episode every other Thursday, but as you may have noticed, today's episode is a few days late. So I'm going to try and do the best I can to stick to that bi-weekly plan. I really want to, but don't be too surprised if there's a few times where the episodes release a few days late. Thank you for your understanding with that. I'm currently working regular overtime right now, and it's sometimes a little hard to fit everything into 2 weeks, but I will do my best, so thank you. Anyway, if you want to reach out to me, feel free to do so at my email of timurpodcast@gmail.com or on Twitter or Facebook at Timur Podcast. If you want to support the show, I'm tired of talking. If you want to support the show, all donations are very much appreciated. I have a Patreon account for the podcast at patreon.com/TimurPodcast. Thank you all for your ongoing support, your encouraging messages, your donations, reviews, and your patience. It keeps the show going, so I really appreciate all of that. I will see you next time, though, as we head north to talk about what's been happening in the lands of the Golden Horde, right here on the Timur Podcast.